The last cart went out under the gate arch of Cauldwell Keep at 4 o'clock on a hot afternoon in June of 1843, and on it was every movable thing the house had held for 200 years. Chairs roped upside down on tables, a long case clock lying in straw like a felled tree, fire irons, bed hangings, the kitchen coppers, 41 framed pictures, and the carpets rolled and tied and stacked like timber. Verity Nash stood in the archway and counted the carts as they passed her, because counting was the only useful thing she had left to do. There were 9 of them. When the 9th had turned out onto the lane, Sir Everard Nash's steward climbed down from the seat of it with a folded paper and a travelling inkstand, and read her the schedule aloud in the yard, in front of the carters and the 2 housemaids and old Hannah Otley, who had been in service at the keep for 51 years and had nowhere else to be sent. It was a long document, and it was very thorough. It listed all goods, chattels, furniture, plate, linen, glass, china, books, pictures, and effects of every description whatsoever then standing or being in the mansion house called Cauldwell Keep, and it recited that the whole of them had that day been removed by and on behalf of Sir Everard Nash, Baronet. And then, at the foot of it, in a clerk's careful hand, it said, "And there remains in the said mansion house nothing of value whatsoever." Mr. Kelsall held out the pen. Verity Nash was 22 years old. She had been a widow for 9 months and a Nash for 18. She read the paper twice all the way through, which surprised him a great deal, and then she signed it, Verity Nash, in a small upright hand, and gave him back his pen, and thanked him, and went inside, and did not come out again until the sound of the wheels had gone off the hill. 6 weeks later she would stand in that same house and understand that the man who wrote that sentence had been hunting for 3 summers for the one thing in England he most wanted, and had just certified in writing, over his own steward's signature, that it did not exist. To understand how she came to be standing in that archway, you have to go back 2 years. To a July afternoon on the home farm at Wrenfield Park, where a girl of 20 was holding the far end of a surveyor's chain in a field of standing barley. Her name then was Verity Harrow. Her father was Josiah Harrow, county surveyor and map-maker of Marchford, a small dry man who had chained half the parishes in the county and drawn them beautifully. He had taught her to hold a chain steady before she was 12 and paid her a penny a sheet to wash in the colours on his finished maps. Umber for the woods, blue for the water. A thin wash of rose along every boundary. She could read a plan before she could sew. She had grown up believing that the look of a thing was an opinion, and the measure of it was a fact, and that when the two disagreed it was always the opinion that was wrong. Thomas Nash came across the field that afternoon to ask what they were doing to his father's barley, and stayed for 2 hours, and came back the following week without any reason at all. He was the second surviving heir of Sir Everard Nash of Wrenfield Park, which in that family meant he was tolerated. They married in December of 1841 in the parish church at Marchford, with her father and 2 of Thomas's friends present and no Nash of any kind. Sir Everard wrote his son 1 letter about it. Thomas never showed her what was in it, and burned it. They had 18 months. Thomas had a small independence of 200 a year, and a house on the edge of the Wrenfield land, and Verity chained fields with her father in the mornings, and was happier than she has any business admitting in a story of this kind. In October of 1842, a fever went through the low villages along the river, and Thomas took it, and was gone, in 11 days. Her father had died the spring before. At 22, she had a black gown, a marbled pocketbook, and no claim on earth that any lawyer would look at twice, because everything Thomas held was settled land, and settled land goes back up the line. She was sent for to Wrenfield Park in May. She had never been inside the house. She was shown into a small square room with a good fire, and Sir Everard Nash came in with his attorney, Mr. Adcock, and did not sit down. He was 59, upright, grey, entirely courteous. He said he had considered her situation. He said the family did not intend that she should be a charge upon the parish. He said he had it in mind to make her a provision. Then Mr. Adcock unfolded a conveyance on the table, and Sir Everard explained it. There was an outlying property in the north of the county, 11 miles from Wrenfield, called Cauldwell Keep. It had not been lived in by the family since 1817. It was, he said, a ruin, and had been assessed as one for the poor rate for a generation. He was willing that it should be hers. He would not give it to her. He was very clear about that, and Mr. Adcock was clearer. A gift, the attorney explained, may be attacked afterwards. A purchase may not. So the conveyance was drawn as a sale, and the consideration named in it was $5, and Sir Everard counted the money out onto the table himself, and pushed it across to her, and waited while she pushed it back, and Mr. Adcock wrote the receipt. The second paper was shorter. It was a release. By it Verity Nash, widow, accepted the said premises in full and final satisfaction of all claims, demands and expectations whatsoever against the estate of Sir Everard Nash and against the family of Nash, and covenanted never to raise any other. She read them both. She read them slowly enough that Mr. Adcock looked at the ceiling and Sir Everard looked at the fire. Then she asked one question, which was whether the sale carried the house and every part of it. Mr. Adcock said, with the faintest smile, that it carried the mansion house, the yards, the outbuildings, the orchard, and the close, and all things whatsoever thereto belonging, and that she need not trouble herself, as there was nothing there. She signed. Sir Everard said, at the door, that it was a roof, and that it was more than her father could have left her, and that he hoped she would be sensible about it in time. He meant, though she did not hear it then, that he hoped she would come back and sell. She walked out to Cauldwell on the 14th of June with a canvas bundle and a rolled bedroll over one shoulder, and 11 miles under her. And she came over the shoulder of the hill at about 8 in the evening, in the last of a long gold day, and stopped where she stood in the track. Nobody had told her what it was. Cauldwell Keep was not a cottage, and it was not a farm. It was a tower, 4 stories of honeyed limestone thrown up in the 14th century by men who expected trouble, 40 feet square at the base, with walls 8 feet thick, and a stair turret at the northeast corner. Grafted onto its west side was a long, gabled range of Elizabethan work, 3 stories and 11 bays of it, put up by a Nash who had money and wanted windows. The whole of it stood alone in a green bowl of meadow, with a chalk track running up to the arched oak door, and the low sun came in from the northwest and lit the stone until it looked like something poured rather than built. And it was falling down. Half the slates were off the range, and the laths showed through like ribs. A lead gutter had come away and hung. The masonry over the great window was split. Ivy had the whole north corner, and the glass house along the near end had collapsed years ago into a heap of frames and broken panes. In the yard, a rusted iron wellhead stood in the sun, bleached grass with its winding drum seized and its chain hanging slack, and a broken cartwheel leaned against the stones beside it. Every window in that enormous building was dark and empty, except one. On the first floor of the range, a single small window at the far end burned warm orange in the middle of all that shadow, and Verity Nash stood in the track with her bundle on her shoulder and looked at it for a long time before she understood that somebody was in there. It was Hannah Otley, 68, with a rushlight and a kettle, in the one room she had been allowed to keep. She had come to Cauldwell at 17 as a still room maid, and had never been anywhere else, and when the carts came she had simply stayed, because there was no order in the schedule about her, and nobody had thought to write one. The two of them went through the house together that first night with the rushlight. Verity had never heard anything like the sound their feet made. The Nashes had taken out the furniture, and the hangings and the pictures and the shutters, and in 3 rooms they had taken the floorboards too. There was a great chamber on the first floor of the range, 60 feet of it with a stone chimney-piece and 11 windows and absolutely nothing else, and their 2 voices came back off the plaster like a third person answering. She slept that night on straw in the still room and woke at 4 with the light coming in and no idea what she was going to eat. What she did over the next 6 weeks was work. She drew every bucket of water for that house out of the rusted well head by hand. She scrubbed the still room, the kitchen passage and 2 rooms of the range, and took in plain sewing from Cauldwell Magna, which sent her a great deal of work and a great deal of talk with it. 7 shillings a week. She and Hannah Otley ate a good deal of nettle soup and were not miserable. The village had a settled opinion about the keep, and the village gave it to her freely. The place was cursed. It had been shut up in her grandfather-in-law's time, and there had been a great destroying of things in the house then, and no Nash had slept there since. The last steward but 4 had gone strange. Nothing prospered at Cauldwell. And every summer, said the village, a light walked in the great chamber. Verity, who had been raised to distrust opinions, wrote all of it down in the marbled pocket book, in the same column and figure-hand her father used, and drew a line under it, because she had also been raised to believe that a story that survives 50 years usually has one true fact in it somewhere holding it up. She also paced the house. She could not help it, heel to toe, counting under her breath, the way she had done since she was 9, every room, every passage, the yard, the orchard, the fall of the ground. In the 2nd week she paced the great chamber and got 41 feet, and wrote it down, and thought nothing whatever about it, because she had not yet paced the outside. On the evening of the 2nd of July she was on her knees in the great chamber, with a bucket and a brush, scrubbing 2 centuries of soot off the boards under the chimney, and the sun was going down behind the hill to the northwest, and she sat back on her heels to move the bucket, and saw the light. It lay across the boards about 4 feet in front of her. It was a ribbon of color perhaps 2 feet long and a hand's breadth wide, and it was ruby at one end and deep gold in the middle and a strong clear blue at the other, and it was quite steady, and it was lying on the floor of a room that had 11 windows in its south wall and none at all in the west. Her first thought was that she had cracked a bottle in the sun. Her second was that she was ill. She got up and put her hand into it, and the colours went over her wrist and up her sleeve, and then she turned round and looked at the west end of that room, which was a flat blank wall of old lime plaster, with a painted dado on it, and not one opening anywhere in its whole width, and the hair stood up on the back of her neck. The light lasted 11 minutes and went out like a snuffed candle. She sat on the floor in the dark for some time. Then she went down to Hannah Otley and asked her, keeping her voice flat, whether she had ever heard of the Cauldwell light. And Hannah said, without looking up from the fire, "Oh yes, that's the light. It walks in the great chamber a fortnight after midsummer, and it has done as long as I've been here. And that's why they say the place is cursed. And I'd not go up there of an evening in July for a £5 note. 50 years of ghost story, and one true fact holding it up." The next evening was clear, and Verity was in the great chamber at 8 o'clock with a stub of chalk and her pocket-book. The light came at 24 minutes past 8. She drew round it. She wrote the date and the time. The evening after was cloudy and nothing came. On the 5th of July it came at 26 minutes past, and lay 3 inches further north than the first mark. And on the 6th it came again and was fainter, and on the 7th it did not come, and did not come again all that year. She had 5 chalk outlines on a bare floor, and the suns bearing for each of them, and she was a surveyor's daughter, and that is the whole of it, really. Light travels in a straight line. If coloured light was arriving on that floor from the west end of the room, then there was a hole in the west end of the room, and if there was no hole in a wall she could see and touch, then the wall she could see and touch was not the west end of the room. The next morning she paced the outside. She started at the northwest corner of the range and walked the length of the west end wall to the southwest corner, 52 feet 3 times and 52 feet every time. The great chamber inside was 41. Even allowing 3 feet for the thickness of an Elizabethan end wall, which was generous, there were 8 feet of building at that end of the house that had nothing inside them. She wrote 5241-11 in the pocket-book and looked at it for a while, and then she went and looked at the wall itself properly for the first time. It was faced in brick. That was the thing she had walked past 20 times without seeing. The whole west end of a stone house was faced, from the ground to the gable, in brick, and the brick was laid in a different bond from the brick of the chimney stacks, and it was worked into 3 tall blind arches, which is to say 3 arches with nothing behind them, filled in flush. Above them, under the gable, ivy had grown over a panel of vertical oak boarding, weathered silver. And there was a buttress, and behind the buttress, 10 feet off the ground where nobody would ever look at it, one of those boards had warped and sprung away from its neighbor, and there was a slot of shadow along it about the width of a finger. She fetched the orchard ladder and went up it in her stockings and put her eye to the slot, and looked into a dark space that smelled of cold stone and old lead, and saw, 6 feet in and slightly to the left, the dull shine of a piece of glass the colour of a garnet. She came down the ladder very slowly and sat on the bottom rung for 10 minutes. Then she carried the ladder back to the orchard and put it exactly where it had been, and pulled the ivy back over the boarding as well as she could reach, and went in and said nothing to anybody, because on the previous Thursday Mr. Kelsall had ridden over from Wrenfield for the 3rd time in 6 weeks to look over the fabric. That was the thing that saved her, and it was Hannah Otley who put it in her hand. Verity asked that night, quite idly, how often the steward used to come to Cauldwell. And Hannah Otley, cutting bread, said that he never used to come at all, not for years and years. And then 3 summers ago he had come with 6 men and a cart, and they had been at it a fortnight. They had lifted every flag in the cellars. The summer after, they had opened the undercroft under the tower and driven iron rods into the mound behind the stable, and sounded all 4 chimneys with a weight on a line. Last summer they had taken up the floors in the 3 rooms at the end of the range, which is why those rooms had no floors now, and had gone away in a very bad temper. And Sir Everard himself had come once, in the rain, and stood in the great chamber for a quarter of an hour saying nothing, and gone away again. Verity Nash sat with a bowl of soup going cold in front of her and rearranged her entire life. He had not given her the keep out of contempt. He had not given her the keep at all. He had sold it to her for $5 and made her sign a release covenanting never to raise any other claim against the family, and he had been very careful indeed that neither paper could ever be undone. He had done that because he had been searching this building for 3 years and could not find what he was looking for, because he could not keep 6 men digging at an empty ruin summer after summer without the whole county asking what he was digging for, and because the moment anyone else guessed there was something at Cauldwell, the price of Cauldwell would stop being a ruin's price. So he had put a penniless widow into it, at the parish's expense rather than his own, and sat back to wait for her to come to him before Christmas and sell it back for whatever he chose to offer. He had put a caretaker in the house. That was all she was. And the caretaker had gone and measured it. Hannah Otley knew the rest of the story, or the village half of it, and it came out over the next 2 nights. In 1817, there had been what the parish still called the Great Destroying. Sir Ambrose Nash, who had built the West Oratory onto the end of the great chamber and glazed it, had died, and his heir was a hard evangelical gentleman who called the windows in it popish rubbish and an offence, and gave orders that every pane of it should be broken and carted to the pit. The steward then was Josiah Fenn. Fenn was paid for the work, and Fenn wrote in his daybook that the work was done. And Fenn built a brick skin over the outside of the oratory and a stud partition of lath and plaster across the inside of it, and painted the dado on, and shut a room out of the house, and never told one living creature, and went to his grave in 1829, a quiet man. And Sir Everard, going through the muniment room at Wrenfield 2 years before, had found Fenn's accounts, the bill for the brick, the bill for the lath, the bill for the lime, and no bill at all for the carting away of any glass, and had worked out that the panels had never been broken. What he could not work out in 3 summers of lifting floors was that they had never been moved either. They were exactly where his grandfather had put them. He had been standing in the great chamber with his back to them. There were, said Hannah Otley, 74 lights in that oratory, because her mother had counted them as a girl, and the old people used to say you could tell the hour by which of them the sun was in. They opened it on the 22nd of July, from the inside, at night, with the shutters of the great chamber propped against the door and a single lamp. It took them 4 hours. The partition was lath and plaster on a stud frame, and it came down in slabs and clouds, and behind the plaster was a wall of loose rubble, packed dry into the frame, and behind the rubble was a stone arch, with its moulding intact and the tooling still sharp on it, and behind the arch was the oratory, 8 feet deep, 22 wide, a stone vault over it, and a floor under 26 years of dust so fine and undisturbed that their feet made prints as clean as prints in snow. And in the west end of it, whole, unbroken, and black as slate in the lamplight, stood the window, 3 great lights below and a rose above. Verity Nash held the lamp up and went along it very slowly with the flame 6 inches from the leadwork, and the lamplight woke the colours a foot at a time as it went, a red so deep it was nearly brown, a blue that had no business existing, gold, a green like a bottle held to a fire, saints and kings and a hunting scene and a great deal of Latin, silvered faces, panels of grisaille between them like frost on a pane, and every single one of them leaded into the stone tracery of the window itself, in its own cusped opening, exactly where Sir Ambrose Nash's glaziers had set it in 1806. She counted 74. She counted them 3 times, and the number was the same each time, and she wrote it in the pocket-book with the date. They did not touch the outer boarding for 2 days. Then on the evening of the 24th, with the sky clear, Verity went up the orchard ladder with a claw-hammer and took the sprung board off, and then the one below it, and then the whole panel. And the low sun came off the hill from the northwest and went through 74 panels of 13th and 15th century French, Flemish and Rhenish glass into a room that had not seen it since 1817. And the light came out of the oratory arch into the great chamber and lay down across the boards in a sheet 20 feet wide. Hannah Otley, 68 years old and 51 of them in that house, sat down on the floor in the middle of it and cried. Verity kept the board. It hangs framed in the oratory to this day, a plain warped piece of weathered oak with a split along one edge, and every visitor asks about it. Now she had it, and now she had to keep it, and she understood the second problem was going to be harder than the first. She wrote 3 letters the next morning. One to Mr. Sowerby, an old country attorney in Marchford who had done her father's conveyancing for 30 years. One to Mr. Julius Brandt, a glass painter and dealer in Norwich, whose father had brought continental glass into England during the wars, and one to Sir Everard Nash, Baronet, at Wrenfield Park, informing him in 4 flat lines that in taking possession of the premises conveyed to her on the 9th of May, she had found the West Oratory, which had been closed in 1817, and that its window was entire. She sent that 3rd letter because Mr. Sowerby, in his reply, told her to. Say it first, he wrote, say it plainly, and say it in writing, and never let it be said that you concealed anything from him, because concealment is the only stick he will be able to find to beat you with. Mr. Brandt came from Norwich in 5 days. He was 61, and he came up the chalk track on foot from the village with his coat over his arm, and Verity took him up to the great chamber and through the arch, and he stopped, and put his hand flat on the stone, and stood there for something over a minute, without saying one word. Then he asked her, in a voice that was not quite steady, whether she would allow him to send for a ladder. He was 3 days at Cauldwell. He took every panel in the book, light by light, cusp by cusp, and what he told her at the end of it was this. 41 of the panels were French and Rhenish work of the 13th and 14th centuries, out of religious houses in the Low Countries and along the Rhine that had been broken up in the wars and had come into England through Norwich between 1802 and 1806 by the crate. 22 were Flemish of the 15th and early 16th centuries, and 4 of those were, in his opinion, as fine as anything then in England. 11 were English, older than the rest, and had almost certainly come out of a church within 40 miles, and the whole of it was in a state, he said, that he had never seen, and did not expect to see again, because the one thing that ruins old glass is time in a window, and this glass had spent 26 years walled up in the dark with a stone vault over it, and the weather off it entirely. Verity asked him what it was worth. Mr. Brant sat down on the step of the oratory and said that there were 4 cathedrals, 2 colleges, and something over 300 new churches in England looking for old glass and unable to get it, that the trade had been picked clean since the wars, and that he would rather not name a figure until he had written to 3 people. Then he named one anyway, because he was honest and he could see her arithmetic face on. He said not less than £16,000, and possibly a good deal more. And Mrs. Nash, I would advise you not to say that number out loud in this county. Mr. Kelsall arrived 8 days later with an offer from Sir Everard of £300 for certain old coloured window glass at Cauldwell, together with the cost of making good the wall. Verity Nash declined it in 1 sentence, in writing, and Mr. Kelsall rode away, and the suit began 3 weeks after that. Sir Everard's case, when it came, was not a stupid one. He said the glass had never passed under the conveyance at all. He said it was the personal property of his family, bought by his grandfather with family money, and that it had not been sold with the house, any more than a portrait taken off a wall and stood in a lumber room is sold with the house. He said it was goods, stored, that the closing of the room in 1817 was a storing, and nothing else, and that goods do not pass with land. Mr. Sowerby, who had never in 30 years appeared against a baronet, and who prepared the case sitting at Verity's kitchen table in the still room at Cauldwell, put 2 answers against it. The first was the law of fixtures, and it turned on the 2 questions the courts had been asking for 40 years. How firmly is the thing fixed, and why was it fixed there? Glass leaded into the stone tracery of a window is not stored in a house. It is the wall. Take it out, and there is a hole in the building, and the weather comes in. Sir Ambrose Nash did not put those 74 panels into that oratory to keep them safe. He built the oratory in order to have somewhere to put them, and cut the tracery to their sizes, and the glazier's cuts were still there in the stone to prove it. It was annexed to the freehold, said Mr. Sowerby, in degree and in purpose both, and it passed with the freehold to Mrs. Nash on the 9th of May for the consideration of $5, receipt whereof was duly acknowledged. The second answer was shorter, and it was Verity's, and she had been holding it since June. If the glass was goods, then on the 14th of June 1843, Sir Everard Nash's own steward had stood in the yard at Cauldwell, in front of 7 witnesses, and read out a schedule prepared by Sir Everard's own attorney, which listed all goods, chattels, furniture, plate, linen, glass, china, books, pictures, and effects of every description whatsoever then standing or being in the mansion house, and which certified, over that same steward's signature, that the whole of them had been removed, and that there remained in the said mansion house nothing of value whatsoever. He could not have it both ways. Either the glass was part of the building, in which case it was hers with the building, or the glass was goods, in which case his own signed and witnessed schedule swore, on the day she took possession, that every article of goods in the house had already gone out of it on his 9 carts. He had put his name to a document saying the house was empty in order to make sure she could never claim anything out of it. And that document was now the only thing in England standing between him and 74 panels of glass. The cause was heard at the county assizes at Marchford in March of 1844, and it took a day and a half. Mr. Brant gave evidence about the cutting of the tracery. A mason of 40 years' standing gave evidence that the brick skin outside was later than the stone and keyed into nothing. Josiah Fenn's day book was produced, and the bills for lath and lime and brick, and the absence of any bill for carting, and the court was told where that day book had lain for the last 2 years and who had been reading it. And at the end of it the schedule was read aloud, in full, from the first line to the last, in a quiet court, in Sir Everard Nash's clerk's careful hand, and there remains in the said mansion house nothing of value whatsoever. Judgment was for the defendant, with costs. The window was held to be annexed to the freehold, and to have passed with it. Verity Nash walked out of the assize court at Marchford at 2:30 in the afternoon, owning, outright and beyond challenge, the finest single collection of medieval glass in private hands in the eastern counties, having paid $5 for it. She sold 22 panels. Not one more. Mr. Brant handled the whole of it and took his commission and earned every penny of it. 14 went to 2 cathedrals and a college chapel, 6 to a new church in the north that had money and no windows, and the two he had told her were the finest things in the room, to a collector in London who paid for them alone what a good farm cost. The whole came to £16,400 and some odd shillings, and Mr. Sowerby put it into the funds for her at 4%, and told her with tears in his eyes that she was now a woman of independent means, and that he had been waiting his entire professional life to say that sentence to somebody who deserved it. The remaining 52 panels never left the oratory, and never will. What she did with the money is the part the county actually remembers. She releaded the roof of the range, stripped the ivy off the north corner, and had the split masonry over the great window cut out and pieced in. She reglazed 11 bays, put floors back into the 3 rooms Sir Everard's men had taken up, and had the wellhead freed and redrummed so the crank turned again, and kept it, rust and all, when the mason offered to replace it. 14 men from Cauldwell Magna worked at the keep for 2 years, in a parish that had been sending its young men away for a generation. And she went into the trade. That surprised everybody, and it should not have. She took Mr. Brant's second apprentice off him and set up a glazing shop in the undercroft of the tower, and by 1848 the Cauldwell shop was cutting, leading and restoring old glass for churches in 5 counties, and Verity Nash was doing the drawings for it herself, in her father's colours, umber, blue, and a thin wash of rose along every edge. In the autumn of 1846, Wrenfield Park's private chapel needed reglazing. There was one shop in the county that could do that class of work, and Sir Everard Nash's agent had to write to Mrs. Nash of Cauldwell Keep and ask for terms. She sent him terms. They were fair terms, at the shop's usual rate, in the same small upright hand she had signed the schedule with, and they were accepted, and the work was done well, because she would not have had it any other way, and because a shoddy job would have been a kind of answer, and she never once in her life gave that man an answer. He came to Cauldwell exactly once. It was July of 1847, on a Thursday, and he was 73 by then and had to be helped up the great stair. Verity Nash met him at the top of it and took him into the great chamber and did not say anything at all, because it was 8:20 on a clear evening in the fortnight after midsummer, and the sun was coming off the hill in the northwest, and there was no need. He stood in the doorway of the oratory his grandfather built, in ruby and gold and that impossible blue, with the light of 74 panels lying across the boards and up his coat and over his hands, in the room where his men had lifted the floors and looked at it for a long time. Then he said, and Hannah Otley heard him say it, that he had stood in this room and had not thought to look behind himself, and he went down the stair and out past the wellhead to his carriage, and was driven home, and the two of them never spoke again. The village stopped saying the keep was cursed at about the same time it began charging visitors a shilling to see the window. Hannah Otley showed them up herself, in a good black gown, got the number of panels right every single time, and enjoyed the whole thing enormously, until she died in her sleep in 1853, in the room with the lit window, having been at Cauldwell for 61 years. Verity Nash lived at the keep for the rest of her life and never remarried and never left the county. She had the great chamber floor sanded and waxed and refused, absolutely refused, to have the chalk marks scrubbed out of the boards under the wax, so that if you go and stand there now on a clear evening in the fortnight after midsummer, you can still see 5 faint outlines on the floor with dates beside them in a small upright hand, the 2nd of July, the 3rd of July, the 5th, the 6th. 5 drawings of a thing that could not be there, made by a woman who had been left a ruin and $5 and a signed and witnessed certificate from the man who wanted it most in all the world, that there remained in the said mansion house nothing of value whatsoever. She paced that room once more, the night before she died, at 81, out of nothing but contentment, heel to toe, counting under her breath the way her father had taught her. 41 feet. It was always going to be 41 feet. The other 11 were the ones that mattered.